Of course, as soon as we start chat, the dogs want to go crazy. They've been cooped up in the house all day. Now they're going nuts. Hey, so I did make this go live. I wasn't sure there for a minute. Hopefully you can hear me and see me okay, and hopefully the dogs aren't making too much noise in the background. And no problem. We've been trying to put out more videos lately. Yeah, as you know, as stuff comes through the shop. And yeah, I've got a couple. I don't think I've got any 100 series, but I've got a couple of videos that are like ready to edit, that I just haven't had time to edit, that I need to get posted. And yeah, glad they help. That's the goal. I've been doing this forever, so it'd be nice to get everything that's up here out into the world if it can be useful. And as folks are tuning in, I put a comment at the top of the screen that's a clickable link, and if you click that link, theoretically it'll let you join like Zoom style, and you can do live questions. But I haven't tried it yet. So if anybody wants to be the guinea pig, click the link and it'll let you ask questions live. And Ernesto wants to know about front vibrations on an 80 series at 55 to 60 miles an hour. It could be a lot of things, but nearly every time we've got vibrations that are in a specific RPM range, it's almost always tires. It's tire balance. I mean, it could be drive shaft, it could be other things, but it's almost always tires when we see it. And then Michael wanted to know 07 LX470 pauses for 2 to 3 seconds before shifting into drive. Any ideas on a fix? It's hard to say without seeing it, but almost always when there's a pause, it's low fluid, because with the low fluid, you're getting air in the system, and it takes a minute to build pressure when you shift between everything. The only thing that's terrible about that is on a '07, there's no trans dipstick, so you've got to go through the whole stupid process of bringing it up to temperature and checking it at the overflow plug. Yeah, it's not a fun process, but I would bet that you've got low fluid. Although we don't usually see those leak, unless you've got a rusty line, like one of the cooler lines, or if for some reason like the radiator was out and it didn't get topped back up fully. But without seeing it, my guess would be low fluid. And Scott wants to know if I can touch base on the Sequoia alternator changeover using the Delta kit. So I have not used the Delta kit. I've done the Wits End version. I mean, it's probably been 6 or 7 years since I've done one. I don't remember it being a super difficult install, other than, snaking the alternator down in there and getting everything lined up. We've got a bunch of customers that have the Delta kit or the Wits End kit, and as far as I know, they haven't had any issues with them. Like, we haven't seen any problems out of them, but we don't see a ton of them. So yeah, I don't have a lot of current firsthand experience on them. And Ernesto said the front tires and wheels have already been balanced. On an 80, my next in line after tires for a vibration would be the front drive shaft, either the angle or U-joints being slightly loose, or what we see a lot of is the slip joints start getting slop and the splines wear, and you'll start getting a harmonic hum out of the splines. So that's something else to check. Usually that'll change sound like as you go over like an undulating road. It'll change, and that'll clue you in that it's the slip joint moving, because as the suspension moves, the slip joint moves in and out to fresh spots in the splines and will change the sound. And Brody says, really enjoy your tech videos. Have a 2011 Cruiser that will not start. Battery's good, turning over, but not starting. It could be anything. You're going to have to, start with the basics. My go-to on a no start is I'll put a little starter fluid, spray it in the air filter, and then try to crank it. And if it'll start and run on starter fluid, you've got compression, you've got valve timing, you've got spark and all that jazz. You're just missing fuel. If it doesn't start on starter fluid, then you're looking at ignition or compression, and usually you'll get a check engine light, like a code stored or something there. And I may not have read that as Tacoma. But same process. First thing I would do is check for codes. Second thing I would do is give it some supplemental fuel and see if it'll start on starter fluid. And if it'll start and run on starter fluid, that narrows it down to fuel filter clogged, fuel pump not doing its thing. But it'll help split the system into chunks with the starter fluid. And then, yeah, if it won't start on starter fluid, then you're looking at engine side of things. And no problem, Ernesto. Vibrations can be real fun to try to track down. They're even worse to try to track down through the internet. We've got a bunch of fancy tools to try to trace down vibration, and even with all them, it can still be horrible to try to track things down. And it's really funny. I'm not sure what you guys are clicking, but on my end, it's coming through and it just says hand dash pink dash waving. I'm assuming it's a hand waving emoji, but the way it's translating it into the streaming software is funny. Nigel did one too. If I could figure out how to watch this live on YouTube and watch the chat, I'd be set. And hopefully the dogs will settle down soon. Or not. Okay, so it is a pink hand waving. It's exactly what the description says it is. Yeah, after last week's live chat, I tried to go back and watch the recorded YouTube version, but I couldn't get the chat, like the actual text part of the chat, to come up because the way some people were commenting last week, it seemed like the software that was bringing it through into the recording wasn't pulling everything into where I can see it. I'm not entirely certain I'm getting all of the chat questions. Michael says he's in the process of changing out the fluid. Fluid was pretty dark but not low. Done one pan drain and fill so far. Do it another two or three more times, and hopefully that fixes the pause. Yeah, luckily on a Land Cruiser, I've never had it be anything other than low fluid. Hopefully that's the case on yours, because I'd imagine if it's not, that's an internal transmission issue. And we do not do automatic transmissions, so I unfortunately I don't have troubleshooting advice for like internal stuff. I've rebuilt one automatic transmission and I will never do it again. That was horrible. And Gabe wants to know what mileage I think 100 series torsion bars and springs begin to fatigue or need to be replaced. I don't know that there is like a really set time frame, and it's going to vary so widely based on what kind of load you're carrying, what kind of roads you're driving over. Somebody that's driving like smooth freeway miles where you're not bouncing up and down, I'd imagine those springs would last a lot longer than somebody that's carrying a ton of weight, off-roading, bouncing up and down, and flexing the springs more. And I would also think, shocks would have a lot of play in the equation. If you're running stiffer tuned shocks that aren't going to let the springs oscillate as much, I'd think the springs would last longer. Obviously, if the truck is sitting lower, then your springs are worn out. And there are measurements in the factory manual. I think it's called Z height. You measure a couple of different places between the frame and the ground, and it'll tell you how worn your springs are based on the ride height. But yeah, I mean we've got 100 series that come through 400,000 miles on them, and they're they still drive well and sit at what looking at it looks like a proper ride height. And then like you'd have like my old buggy that was coil spring swapped. I could kill a set of rear coil springs in one event because it was flexing them so much they would just wear out. So I just used cheap junkyard springs in that and swapped them every time they got kinked. Yeah, I wouldn't think towing a 4,000-pound boat would have a super detrimental effect, but it always could. But you could always use like the airbags that go inside the rear coils, to give them some extra support and get a little bit of load carrying back if you needed it. The only thing that you got to watch out for is running the line so that they don't chafe and pop. And while we've got a pause in questions, I set up a page called SpeakerPipe, and I put links in all the descriptions to the videos, but it basically lets you leave a voicemail so that if you're not able to tune in to the live stream to ask a question, you can leave an audio like a voicemail, and I can play it back. And we got one earlier this week, and so I uploaded it. So I'm going to try playing that and see if it works. Let's see if this works.
Technical projects and the patience required, the tools required, and there can be a disconnect between the younger and older generation on it. And I'm wondering if you've noticed a similar thing, and if people have the patience and aptitude to listen to something that would be along the lines of one member helping another. I'm curious if you've had a similar thought on this. These projects can be pretty hard, and we're all doing them alone a lot of the time. It just seems like a pretty interesting concept if there were to be something like this. Thanks. Bye.
So were you guys able to hear that question that was a call in? He was asking about mentorships and if the Land Cruiser community would be into it. Uh, like basically the old generation disseminating knowledge to the younger folks. And I think I Hate Mud does, a decent job of consolidating all the information into one place, but there's a lot to sort through. And that's, partly why we started a YouTube channel and why we do the live chats is to try to, get more information on fixing these trucks out there and let people ask questions. And I think he was trying to ask more about like one-on-one mentorships, like where somebody could pay like an admittance fee for like, an older person's time to help go through a project, which I thought was a pretty cool idea, but didn't know if you guys had any thoughts on that or if you were even able to hear that. And then Michael said that he put a new factory steering rack last year and it doesn't feel right. If the wheel isn't straight and he hits the gas, it really wants to pull the wheel more. And if you give the wheel a little tug while accelerating, the wheel wants to wobble back and forth. And to me, that seems like an alignment issue, like caster or probably caster is out of whack. So I would get it aligned with a good alignment shop and see what that does for you. That would be my best guess without seeing it. I guess you could have the rack off center, and when it was aligned after getting the rack installed, they compensated with the tie rods and caster and camber to get it back straight. But I wouldn't think so. I would think it's just like not, the alignment's not set properly. And we see it a lot on 100 series where the adjustment cams get seized and the alignment shop works around it by moving the adjustment somewhere else to try to tweak everything back into the green. Doesn't always work, and you get weird pulls as a result. And Andrew says he has a 100 series with the third brake light leak. Do you recommend any sealant or just install a new light as is? You have to be real careful with sealant. A lot of especially like home-based RTVs or even like engine stuff, it's acidic. And if you use it to seal like a body-related something, you'll end up doing more harm than good because you'll end up basically putting acid on the metal and eating it. I would just install the new light as is. I think they come with a new foam, like a foam weather strip. Yeah, I mean, if you were going to do anything, you could use like, I just went brain dead, a weather strip adhesive. It's like basically like contact cement. You could use that because that's weather resistant and it's not acidic. That I would probably just put it in as is. And thanks, Jeff, for letting me know that the audio worked. That's the first time I've tried uploading one of the voicemail questions into the mixer so that I could play it back in line, and I didn't know if I had all the settings set properly. So awesome, thanks. Okay, yeah, if the new lights got foam on it, I would just run it that way. I'd imagine that, after 20 years, the factory foam broke down and it was letting it leak, and new foam, unless the tailgate or the lift gates bent or mangled, should seal it. And realistically, there should be weep holes in the bottom of the lift gate. So any moisture that gets in there should come out the bottom without causing any issues. And Michael says he believes he used a Toyota Land Cruiser rack on the Lexus. Is it possible the problem is something to do with the variable gear ratio system and not playing nice with the LC rack? So I am not 100% sure that they're the same rack between the two. I think they are, but I'm not positive. I know whenever we do steering racks, we get them from our local Toyota dealer, but I don't know. I've never actually paid attention to the part numbers to know if they're giving us a different rack for the ones that we give them a Lexus VIN number for. I think there's only 2 different racks, so I wouldn't think that would be it. But one thing with the variable gear, you may need to recenter, like with a scan tool, you may need to recenter the actual motor in the column. We picked up a 200 series from alignment this morning, and Crash got in the truck to bring it back to the shop. And where the alignment shop is, you have to make a U-turn to come back to the shop. And as soon as you made a U-turn, it threw warning lights on, and the steering wheel went crooked. We went back to the alignment shop. It's like, hey, steering wheel's off, lights are on. What's up? So they were like, oh, we'll redo the alignment. And they called us like an hour and a half, 2 hours later, and they're like, hey, alignment's done. We rechecked it. You're good. We go back over there. We pick it up. As soon as Crash makes the U-turn, Lights come back on, steering wheel goes crooked. Pulls back in, and they're like, I don't know. We aligned it. Like, alignment's good. And apparently they didn't test drive it or anything. So they brought it back to the shop, and I did the steering sensor reset at the shop. And the owner of the alignment shop called, and they're like, oh, apparently there's a sensor that needs to be reset that we didn't even know was a thing. And it's like, oh, how are you guys doing alignments, not knowing that you have to reset the steering angle sensors and all that jazz afterward? I think this was a 2017 200, which was the newest thing we'd taken them. And the first time we've had an issue with their alignment, but I believe you've got to reset the variable gear on the 100 series when you do an alignment. I can't recall us ever having taken one for alignment, but that might be something to look into. Like if the alignment's good, checking, they'll either call it steering angle sensor or I think it's 0 point calibration. And we don't end up playing with it much because usually the alignment shop takes care of all that for us. But we recently tried a new alignment shop and I got to play with it today. And the owner of the alignment shop called us back and they were super apologetic and were like, hey, well, we'll refund the alignment. It's like, no, you're good. Just know for the next one, you're going to have to reset it. I'm about ready for a nap. Michael says, '04 Land Cruiser keeps showing P0430 along with a noticeable lack of power. What would you check for a proper diagnostic? P0430, if I'm recalling correctly, is bank 2 catalytic converter insufficient function. So it's, it can be the catalytic converters, getting weak and worn out, or it can be the oxygen sensors not reading properly. So my go-to, like I would hook up a scan tool and, go into engine data. And my first thing I would do is look at short-term and long-term fuel trims for, banks 1 and bank 2. And I want to make sure that, if I take bank 1, short-term and long-term, if I add them together, I don't want them to be more than 10%. Ideally, I don't want them more than like 4 or 5%. So if, like long term is, +6 and short term's -2, you'd add up to 4, and 4 in either direction. And that's like a real down and dirty that, you're in fuel control, because 0 would be you're not adding or subtracting fuel from the base table. And the bigger the numbers go in either direction from that, the bigger the correction the computer's making. So if my bank-to-bank fuel trims are looking pretty even side to side or plus or minus, it's a pretty good indication that your oxygen sensors and the air fuel sensors are working properly. And from there, I would take and graph the upstream sensors and the downstream sensors. And this is also a really down and dirty. When you're driving, say you get up to a steady cruise, your upstream sensors are going to switch steadily because it's going to constantly add fuel and subtract fuel to find that happy range. And if you can see that the oxygen sensors going, I want to say it's like from 0.1 to 0.8, and it's going up and down, that sensor's working okay. And then the rear sensor should be a pretty flat line. If you're at a steady cruise and it's like mirroring the front sensor, it means the catalyst isn't storing oxygen anymore. And that's how the system is checking for a 420 or a 430. That rear sensor, it's got a lot of activity on it. If you have leaky exhaust manifolds or like a leaky gasket between the manifold and the cat, where you've either got exhaust going out or unmetered air coming in, that can also skew it enough to throw a code. So yeah, before you do the testing, like the first thing the manual always tells you to rule out is leaks in the exhaust system. So if you've got leaks, you've got to rule those out first, and then I rule out the sensors. And if the sensors test good and I don't have any leaks and my rear O2 is tracing the front one, then I'm pretty confident that it's a catalytic converter actually failing. I don't usually have good luck with smoke testing. I've only got the regular like evap smoke machine, so it only puts out maybe 1 psi of pressure. And by the time you fill the whole exhaust system up, a lot of times it's not enough to actually show. So sometimes I'll fill the exhaust with smoke and then put actual air pressure in behind it to try to add more pressure to the system. Like it'll show like really big leaks, like gross leaks. But usually you can hear those and find them pretty easily. I have a lot more luck with just taking a welding glove and putting my hand over the tailpipe to create back pressure, while somebody else listens to the exhaust to see where it's leaking at. Yeah, I've tried smoking them a few times, just without really good luck. And I've looked at they make high pressure smoke machines for doing like turbo intercooler piping and stuff like that. But I think those are like $3,000. And, my regular evap smoke machine, I think it was like 15 or 1800. And that was way more money than I get the use out of it because we don't break it out that often. So I haven't been able to bring myself to buy one of the high pressure smoke machines yet. And I just realized it's two different Michaels asking questions. But at 210K, I mean, you're in the ballpark range of when we start seeing converters failing on the 100. Like, we don't see a ton of them, but we're starting to see more as the trucks get older, and they are very expensive. So you want to really narrow down the testing and make sure that it's the converter before you commit to it. I totally just had a thought for something to put in as filler, and as soon as it popped into my head, it left. I should not have been up so late last night. And I guess I'll pop in another one of the voicemail messages that somebody left us on SpeakerPipe. This one's kind of funky. There's like running water in the background, so I'm not really sure what's going on. But I'll play that real quick. So I would not go through the trouble of adding a factory rear axle to a truck that didn't have it. Because you're going to need, it's a whole different rear housing because the locked housing has a cutout where the actuator slides. So it's not just a matter of bolting, a factory locker diff in there. It's a different housing, and I've heard that the actual frame harness and everything is there, but I've never verified it. But you'd need a rear axle housing that was factory locked. You'd need the harness that comes from the frame down to the housing. And I believe you need they call it the locker computer. It's just a relay pack that goes up in the kick panel. At least that's how it is on the 80 series. I don't know that you're gaining much going with a factory locker over using like an aftermarket e-locker, like a Eaton e-lock or a Harrop, something like that, or even an ARB. Although I don't like ARBs lately. We've seen a lot of seals leaking on those, like the spinny O-rings. So I generally just put Eaton e-lockers in. It drops into your factory housing, drops into your factory differential. Like, you don't end up messing with pinion. It's carrier bearings, reset the backlash, drop it in, run their wiring harness, switch on the dash, done. Yes, factory e-lockers are cool, but I don't think it justifies the amount of work and extra stuff you're going to have to dig up to do it. And then 93 FCJ80 just started to lose my speedometer intermittently. How would you diagnose, or is there a common part failure? I can't remember if a 93 is cable driven or if it's a speed sensor. I know the 95 to 97s are a speed sensor. I think the 93 94s are, but I'm not positive. If it's cable driven and you're intermittently losing it, it's probably the cable failing. They'll break and then they'll still rub, and you'll get some speedo output, but not all the time. Where I would start diagnosing it is a good question. I don't think I've ever had to diagnose speedometer in a 93 or 94. And I think when I've done it in a 95, 97, it's been like blatantly obvious the wiring got ripped out of the sensor. So I never had to go any further than that. I would get a hold of a factory manual or like one of the PDF versions of a factory manual, and I'm sure there's a troubleshooting section for speedometer, and you'll just have to work through the flow chart to see what's going on. We see tons and tons and tons of 80s, and like I said, I don't think I've ever seen a failure on a speedometer on one. It wasn't just the wires ripped off the back of the transfer case. Like the more modern trucks, we've seen, like on the 100 series, we've seen a couple of the actual speed sensors go bad. I don't think I've ever seen one go bad on an 80. Sorry, not much help with that one. If I'm reading Michael's cat question right, looks like it's a California car, which means the converters are going to be even more expensive than what we see on federal stuff here in Virginia. Yeah, and on the hundreds, I have not had any good luck with aftermarket converters. Like, we only use the factory ones. Every time we've put an aftermarket converter on anything, 6 months later, it comes back with the light on. We've seen a few where the aftermarket converters, the light's back on within a week. Oh, and I should mention that when I do all the edit and upload this as an actual, like, podcast on YouTube and everything else, I'll put the links for the SpeakerPipe webpage where you can leave voice messages like the ones I was playing. And I'll also try to insert the link to do the live call in. I put it at the top of the chat on here, and I think it's in the description in case anybody wants to try that. I think it'd be fun. Over the winter, we did a short-lived podcast on a different platform where people could call in live audio. And that was a lot of fun because you could actually go back and forth and ask questions and answer questions. So if this one lets you do it audio and video, and I think that'll be really fun if anybody ever wants to try it. But the link's up at the top. And Jeff wants to know if we're seeing tariff impacts on parts. Starting to see lots of mentions in Facebook groups. Yes, we are. We send out a ton of estimates to people, and a lot of times people have to save up and prepare for the larger estimates. So we're getting people now that we're getting people that we wrote the estimates for 3 or 4 months ago. They finally got the money together to do the job, and we're having to go back and double check parts pricing, and we're not seeing huge jumps on a lot of stuff, but like we had a Ford F-150 that we quoted, a remanufactured Ford steering rack on, and we quoted it, like a couple months ago. And the guy, he was like, "Hey, you quoted this a couple months ago. Can you do it any cheaper?" We're like, "I don't think so, but we'll check." And we checked, and the steering rack had gone up like $300 since we quoted it. So I want to say it went from like $700 to $1,000. We're seeing it more on like the American stuff and not super bad through Toyota, although some of the Toyota stuff has gone up, but it hasn't gone up astronomically, luckily. But we are going back and rechecking every estimate, if it's been any amount of time since we wrote it. And like we've had to go back through, we have a lot of like hand jobs in our estimating software, like stuff we do over and over and over again. And we've had to go back through and update the pricing in those multiple times as it's going up lately. And Michael wants to know if we recommend OEM or Doug Thorley for manifolds on 100 series. I've done both. The Thorleys are more difficult to install. Not a ton more because it's a tubular header. The way it's all routed, it seems like there's a tube blocking access to every one of the mounting bolts. So you can't really get a torque wrench on it. You're fishing ratcheting wrenches in and around it, and they're more of a pain. We don't really see any seat of the pants power gains from them. We had a customer with a supercharged 100, and you could tell a difference going to the Thorleys, from factory to Thorley on that. But on a stock 100 series motor, I don't know that you're going to really notice a ton of difference. We used to do the Thorleys more because they were less expensive than the factory manifolds. They've gone up in price. Factory manifolds have come down in price. So they're about the same, maybe a little bit cheaper for factory manifolds. I would say we probably do factory manifolds 90% of the time. They crack, but they took 15, 20 years before they did it. And the Thorleys they haven't been out as long as as the factory ones. So we don't know if the Thorleys are going to crack as well. Not saying they're going to, but they just haven't been out long enough to know. So we usually do the factory just because it's easier to get them. The Thorleys, a lot of times they're on back order or they're just out of stock. And, either way, we've got to, get them shipped in from California. Whereas if we call our local Toyota dealer, I can have them, the next morning. So we almost always go factory. They're easier to install, faster to get, and it's a known entity. I can hear the dogs at the other end of the house, and I'm really hoping they're not getting into mischief because nobody else is home right now to watch them. Yeah, if nobody else has any more questions, I think I might knock off of here a little bit early. I am whooped. I did not think about the fact that I scheduled this the night after we went into DC to see a show. So I have not really slept since yesterday. But yeah, I'm going to jump off of here and I'm going to try to make Thursdays a regular thing for doing this, and I'll, schedule the next one out. If you end up having questions in the meantime, use the speaker pipe link. You can leave us a voicemail, and I just went completely brain dead. But yeah, and Michael just popped up. Do people ship cars to you for repair? Where is your shop? Yes, we do get ship-ins. We are in Bealton, Virginia. We're about an hour southwestish of Washington, D.C., so just outside Shenandoah National Park, if you know where that is. But yeah, we get ship-ins. We get, from up and down the East Coast. Georgia's the furthest south, maybe Florida, which I guess you can't get any more further south than Florida. And I know we've had as far north as New Hampshire. But yeah, we do get ship-ins, and we're pretty centrally located on the East Coast. But yeah, with that said, I'm going to jump off of here for the evening, go let the dogs out. Hopefully you found this useful. If you do, please tune in next week. And thanks to everybody that tuned in, asked questions. This doesn't work without people asking questions, because as you can see, I'm not good at filling space. Yeah, I'll catch you next week, Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for tuning in.